Okay? So I'll give you some examples of what I mean by this later in the lecture. But this is a very important concept to remember, that these instructional models, or pedagogical models as I will say in a second, are not curricula by themselves. They are meta-curricula. They are design specifications for teachers to use.
Então, os modelos de instrução não são currículo em si, eles são metacurrículo. Eu vou falar um pouquinho mais adiante sobre modelos pedagógicos, mas é importante que vocês tenham isso em mente. Eu vou dar alguns exemplos mais para frente daquilo que eu me refiro, que eu chamo de especificação de design.
Okay, so one last thing about terminology. And as Carla is discovering, I like to be very precise about concepts and how we use concepts.
Em termos de terminologia, a Carla aqui sabe, tem descoberto como eu sou bastante preciso em termos de terminologia.
So Metzler uses the term instructional model. But for me, that just highlights one part of the complex whole that we need to attend to.
Metzler usa o termo instrução, né? Mas para mim ele enfatiza uma parte, mas ele não dá conta de todos os modelos.
Anne Jewett's work concentrated on curriculum models.
O trabalho de Anne Jewett está concentrado no modelo curricular.
So my preference is to talk about pedagogical models, because pedagogy focuses on the interdependence of learning, teaching, and content in particular contexts. Three components that are irreducible. They interact together.
Eu prefiro usar o termo pedagógico porque ele enfatiza essa interdependência, né, e irredutabilidade de termos como aprendizagem, ensino, conteúdo e o contexto, principalmente conteúdo.
So we're going to use the term from now on, pedagogical model.
Então, de agora em diante, nós vamos usar o termo modelo pedagógico.
The second term that I want to introduce is this idea of models-based practice.
O segundo termo que eu gostaria de introduzir é o da prática baseada em modelos.
So this describes the approach to physical education.
Ele descreve a abordagem da educação física.
And I like it because it's an institutionally neutral term.
Eu gosto dele porque ele é um termo institucionalmente neutro.
So models-based practice, you can use it in schools, but you could also use it in clubs, you can use it in community settings. It doesn't have the connotation of instruction or curriculum that make it sound as if it's only for schools.
E o motivo que eu gosto dele é que esse termo modelo baseado em prática, ele pode ser transferido para outros cenários que não cenários necessariamente escolares e que envolvam o termo currículo.
Okay, so that's the second part of my presentation finished. We talked about what's the problem with traditional physical education, and I've introduced the concepts of pedagogical models and models-based practice.
Então, essa parte da minha apresentação está encerrada. Nós falamos sobre o ensino pedagogical models,
Models-based practice.
Modelo pedagógico, a prática baseada no modelo e o ensino de educação física.
Okay, so now I want to go on and look at the components of pedagogical models, and this is following Metzler's approach. So I'm going to talk about foundations, I'm going to talk about teaching and learning characteristics or features, I'm going to talk about implementation needs and modifications, and occasionally I will refer to an example from some work that I'm doing with my colleague Lane Harrings at the University of Ghent, where we're developing a pedagogical model for health-based physical education.
Então, agora nós vamos falar sobre, o enfoque vai ser nos componentes dos modelos pedagógicos. Vou falar dos fundamentos, das características de ensino e de aprendizagem, das necessidades de implementação e modificação, e, eventualmente, eu posso me referir ao trabalho que eu estou desenvolvendo com o professor Lynn Hartz, na universidade, acerca de um modelo pedagógico que seja para a educação física baseada na saúde.
Okay, so foundations. What are the features, the contents of the foundations? The first thing is that there's a theory and rationale that explain the central design concepts behind the model.
Antes de mais nada, a gente vai falar sobre a teoria e a justificativa que está por trás dos conceitos de design centrais, dos conceitos de design centrais por trás do modelo.
We didn't rehearse this, you can tell. Okay?
Okay, sure.
Second, there are some assumptions about teaching and learning. For example, is the teacher a facilitator, a motivator? Is the student an active learner? In the health-based physical education context, these would be some of the assumptions about teaching and learning. Then each model has a major theme. So in the case of health-based physical education, it's learning to value the physically active life. Learning to value the physically active life. That's the central theme. Then we can talk about the learning domains and their interactions. So here we're talking about the affective, the cognitive, and the psychomotor. In the case of health-based physical education, all three are very important.
No caso da educação física, todos esses três são bastante importantes.
Then what are the student learning development requirements? What's the readiness to learn? And finally, how do we validate the model? And this is really based on the research literature and also on teachers' craft knowledge. So these are the key features of the foundations of any pedagogical model.
Então essas são, na verdade, as principais características de qualquer fundamentação de um modelo pedagógico.
Okay, so what are the teaching and learning features? Metzler says that there's a continuum between directness and indirectness. So in other words, this involves the extent to which teachers and students control the learning process. To what extent do students and teachers control the learning process? What are the learning tasks? What do students need to do to achieve the learning outcomes? What are the engagement patterns for learning? Are they active or passive? Are they whole class? Or are they group? Or are they individual? What are the teacher and student role responsibilities? So some of these might be required by the school as an institution, and some might be quite specific to a particular model. How do we verify the instructional process? In other words, how do we know that we're actually practicing the model?
Como é que nós sabemos que, de fato, o modelo pretendido está sendo praticado?
So Metzler has developed what he calls benchmarks, which are really teacher and student behaviors that allow us to say whether, in fact, there is fidelity of the program. Are we really doing the model?
Então, ele desenvolveu os benchmarks, os critérios que nos permitem estabelecer, né, avaliar se estamos realmente seguindo o modelo.
Now, the final component of teaching and learning is assessment, which is of crucial importance. But very interestingly, in the case of health-based physical education, if the central theme is valuing the physically active life, this might not be very easy to assess in the short term. So we need to understand that there may be some limits to what's possible with assessment.
A gente precisa estar ciente que existem algumas limitações em termos de avaliação, porque se a avaliação busca informação sobre o que é a vida realmente ativa, a gente tem que entender que nem sempre isso poderá ser feito ou poderá surgir imediatamente.
Okay, this is in very good Portuguese. Implementation needs and modifications.
São as necessidades de implementação e as modificações, então em português bem caprichado.
Okay, so the first thing is teacher expertise. What do teachers need to know to teach this model? In the case of health-based physical education, do they understand how to motivate learners? Do they understand the biophysical processes of exercise? Do they understand the socio-cultural and economic barriers to participation? What are the contextual requirements? Do you have appropriate facilities, time, equipment, learning materials? And what are the contextual modifications? Are there some aspects of the model that need to be modified to meet particular circumstances? Local circumstances of the teacher, of the students, the school, and the communities. Okay, so implementation needs and modifications. Finally, the need for research and development. We would argue that there has to be research and development underpinning each of these models. And this is something that we have not done very well, in my view, in physical education, is using research to help us to progress our teaching and our programs.
Como ele disse, deve haver uma pesquisa em desenvolvimento nessa área. De acordo com a visão, com a minha visão, eu acho que nós não temos sido bem sucedidos nesse sentido. Tem sido muito pouca pesquisa e desenvolvimento tem sido empreendidos nessa área.
I would suggest there needs to be systematic collaboration between universities and school teachers in order to achieve this. And I've put here a web page. This is called Physical Education Practitioner Research Network.
Eu sugiro que isso deva ser feito de uma maneira sistemática entre os pesquisadores universitários e os profissionais das redes, os profissionais de ensino. Por isso, eu sugiro aqui, eu coloquei um endereço que está ali, que é a redes de pesquisa do praticante, daquele que pratica e trabalha.
So I would encourage you to visit this webpage. This is something that my colleague, Dr. Ashley Casey, developed at the University of Bedfordshire. And it will give you an example of how teachers and researchers can share information and develop ideas that allow us to progress models-based practice in schools.
Eu sugiro que vocês consultem esse endereço. Essa rede foi criada por um colega meu, o professor Casey, e é um excelente modo de professores trocarem informações e um bom exemplo do que está sendo feito.